In the name of the God of welcome, Amen. One of the reasons I look forward every spring to coming back to Hong Kong to teach at Minghua Theological College is that I'm also coming home to St. John's Cathedral. And so I'm especially grateful to Dean Chan for the opportunity to share this pulpit as we approach the most solemn part of the Lenten season. We just heard a story about Mary and her sister Martha. Do you remember them? They make several appearances in the Gospels as we hear the story of Jesus. When we meet them in Luke's Gospel, Jesus is a guest in their home, and Martha is working away in the kitchen while Mary is so fascinated by what Jesus is saying that she does something no Jewish woman of her time would have done. She goes and sits with the men to listen to Jesus. And Martha isn't very happy about being left in the kitchen, and she suggests to Jesus that he might tell Mary to go and help her. Now, you might think that Jesus would agree with her. After all, preparing dinner for Jesus is surely a privilege, and hospitality is certainly something that Jesus approves of. But no, in effect, Jesus tells Martha to chill out. Mary is the one who has made the right decision. The next time we meet the two sisters, their brother Lazarus is critically ill, and they call for Jesus, but by the time he gets there, Lazarus has already died. Once again, Martha's the one who takes charge. When Jesus arrives, she's the one who meets him and comments that if he'd only been there, her brother would not have died. But he's already been buried. All her sister Mary does is weep, overcome by her grief. And Jesus is so moved that he weeps too. And then he performs the mightiest sign of his ministry. He calls for Lazarus to come out of the tomb, and he does. And today we hear how Jesus and his companions are back at the home of Lazarus and his sisters, and Lazarus is at the table with Jesus while Martha is back in the kitchen. And Mary interrupts the meal by pouring fabulously expensive ointment on Jesus' feet and drying them with her tears. Now, in Jesus' time, there was nothing unusual about having your feet washed. In a world where everyone wore sandals and streets were filthy, it happened whenever guests came to your house. But it was a slave's job, not the host's. And certainly they wouldn't have used perfume that cost the yearly wages of a laborer. Drying his feet with her hair is a kind of intimacy that would have struck everybody there as strange, and yes, as inappropriate in Jesus' time as it sounds to us. Of all people, it's Judas, who's about to sell Jesus for a tenth of what Mary's paid for the perfume, who says out loud what everybody was probably thinking. Maybe it's what we're thinking too. What on earth is going on? Mary is just one in a long line of people who behave toward Jesus in an unexpected way, a way that most people would have considered inappropriate. There's the woman with the hemorrhage who touches Jesus even though she knows, as everyone else knew, that Jews would consider her touch enough to make them unclean. There's the Samaritan woman whom Jesus asks for a drink of water and who ends up having a theological discussion with him. And everybody thought that Samaritans were unclean. There's Nicodemus, who sneaks to see Jesus at night because he doesn't want anybody to see him talking to Jesus. There's the deranged man living in a cemetery who recognizes who Jesus is before anybody else does. There's the Gentile woman who insists that Jesus heal her daughter and won't take no for an answer. There's a group of people suffering from leprosy whom Jesus not only allows to approach him, but he heals them. In every one of those situations, we would expect for Jesus to do what anybody else would have done. Cross the street to avoid them. Turn his back. Reproach them. Scold them. Send them away. And in every case, Jesus does exactly the opposite. He not only allows them to come close, he invites them to come close. Closer than we would expect, closer than we would tolerate. Having someone dry your feet with their hair while you're having dinner at their house was just as bizarre, just as unacceptable for Jews 2,000 years ago as it would be in Hong Kong in 2025. Judas and maybe even her brother and everybody else at the table would have wanted Jesus to stop her. She's just wasted thousands of dollars worth of perfume. She's just interrupted what was meant to be a nice dinner among friends. She's made a spectacle of herself. She's just embarrassed her family. Probably there was only one person there who wasn't wishing she'd stop, and that was Jesus himself. And that's because he was the one, the only one, who understood what was really happening. Mary hadn't just rummaged around on her dressing table for the perfume she used. Jesus understood what it was for. The perfume she uses to wash his feet is what she would use to anoint his body for burial. I suspect that everybody else at that dinner was surely trying to pretend that everything was normal, everything was just fine, we're just here to have a nice dinner. But Mary saw what was happening, and she saw what was going to happen. The story we just heard didn't happen a week before Palm Sunday. Luke tells us it happened on Saturday night, and the very next morning, Jesus would make his way to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, knowing perfectly well that when he rode into Jerusalem on that donkey, to the cheers of the crowd, he was going toward the inevitable end of his life. And before the week was over, he would be arrested and condemned and tortured and crucified and buried in a borrowed tomb. And Mary was the one who understood what was happening. What moved her wasn't inappropriate. It was love and it was grief. It seems to me that what Mary felt is so very appropriate for this day. Luke's gospel lets us have a glimpse of what it must have been like for the people who were closest to Jesus, the people who knew him best, as the clouds around him grew darker. By this time, they'd been through so much with Jesus. They'd gone from being astonished to what he was doing, the signs he kept giving them that God was up to something, to being captivated by what he was saying, the new insight he gave them into what God was like, as they gradually came to understand that God really did love them in spite of everything. They probably never quite got over being surprised by Jesus because he kept doing and saying things they didn't expect, refusing to be bound by the petty prejudices of his own people, ignoring their ideas of what was and wasn't appropriate, who was in and who was out, suggesting that in God's eyes, and therefore in his eyes, everybody was in and nobody was out. And the closer they got to Jesus, the more they responded to his love with love of their own, and the more they must have realized that he was offending some very powerful people, people who could threaten him, people who were quite capable of doing him harm. Peter saw that. That's why he tried to talk Jesus out of even going to Jerusalem. And on that Saturday night, they all must have realized that things were coming to a crisis point, and as hard as they tried to be calm, they must have felt fear for Jesus and also fear for themselves. But it's Mary who goes beyond the fear to realizing how this story is going to end and preparing herself and preparing Jesus for what was surely going to happen. Love and grief. What moved Mary on that long ago night. Love and grief. What surely moves us on this Passion Sunday as we watch, as we do every year, and as we find out all over again just how strong is God's love for us and how much it costs him. Amen.